No one even knew her name until she touched the piano keys and silenced the entire class, even the teacher. One moment, and everything turned upside down. At Roosevelt High School, nestled in the heart of Augusta, Georgia, Amira Bennett had grown used to being overlooked. At 16, this black girl wasn't lazy or rebellious. Quite the opposite. Amira was the kind of student any parent would dream of, always turning assignments on time, sitting in the front row, never causing disruption. But for 3 years of high school, no matter how hard she tried, she remained a shadow in the classroom. It wasn't that Amira was completely ignored. She got marked present. She received her graded tests. But she was never truly seen. Whenever she raised her hand to answer, teachers would often glance past her, calling instead on another student, a white student, a student with an easy-to-pronounce name, a student who fit the image they favored. Amira could never shake the feeling, that deep, persistent sense that she wasn't important enough to be heard. She wasn't disliked. She was dismissed, as if no one ever really expected her to contribute something meaningful. Nowhere was that more obvious than in her U.S. history class with Ms. Carmichael. That class always began with open-ended questions. Who can tell me about the Constitution of 1787? Who remembers why the Gettysburg Address was significant? Questions like these echoed through the room every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and every time Amira Bennett was the first to raise her hand. But her hand, thin, hopeful, steady, was almost never called on. Ms. Carmichael would glance in her direction, sometimes pause for a second, then pivot toward students like Madison Hayes or Connor Whitfield, the ones who always seemed to catch her attention, usually white students, often children of PDA regulars, featured in school photo galleries, or simply the type of kids who felt comfortable to her. Amira wasn't jealous. She just felt weightless, as if her presence in the room were no more substantial than a mist in the corner. She tried. She studied late into the night, read ahead, made color-coded flashcards, even took notes in 3 different colors of ink. But nothing seemed to draw her teacher's eyes to her desk. Amira's silence didn't come from shyness. It was a result of being passed over 100 times, of thousands of glances that never landed. Slowly, she learned to withdraw from the conversation. Not because she had nothing to say, but because no one ever really wanted to hear it. At first, she held on to hope. Every time Miss Carmichael entered the classroom, Amira would whisper to herself, "Maybe today will be different." But as the days wore on, she stopped expecting anything. Still, she raised her hand because it was the right thing to do. But inside, she was already bracing for that familiar feeling of being unseen one more time. What hurt most wasn't the favoritism. It was a quiet certainty that she would fail, that she didn't belong, that her intelligence wasn't worth pausing to hear. It wasn't overt contempt. It was something more insidious, a form of systematic indifference. Amira didn't cry. She never protested. But every morning, as she stepped into that classroom, she had to armor her heart in invisible steel, and in some ways, that was the heaviest burden of all. Friday morning in U.S. history began like any other. Amira Bennett sat in her usual spot, 3rd desk from the front along the wall. Her notebook was already open, and her wooden pencil was sharpened to a perfect point. She had finished a chapter on Gettysburg 2 days ago. Miss Carmichael entered the room, her blonde hair curled neatly and her charcoal gray suit pressed sharp. A stack of ungraded tests rested in her hand. Her voice rang out, flat and even like always. "Today, we'll be talking about the Gettysburg Address. Who can tell me what Lincoln emphasized in that speech?" Amira didn't hesitate. Her hand rose instinctively. She sat up straighter, eyes fixed on the board. And then something unthinkable happened. "Amira," Miss Carmichael said. A stunned silence rippled across the room. Did she just say Amira? A few students turned in their seats, wide-eyed with disbelief. Amira was a beat slow to respond, her heart skipping. But she quickly steadied her breath. It was a speech delivered by President Lincoln in 1863. She began, her voice soft but clear, given at the Gettysburg Cemetery to honor fallen soldiers, and to reaffirm the importance of freedom and equality as foundational ideals of America. The room was silent, a flawless answer. Ms. Carmichael nodded, but it wasn't a nod of approval. It was the kind of nod that felt dismissive. She murmured, turning to walk back toward her desk. Not bad. There was something cold in the tone that Amira felt deep in her chest. The class slipped back into its usual rhythm, but quiet tension still lingered in the air. Amira felt her heart pounding in her ribcage, a strange unease crawling down her spine. Then Miss Carmichael's voice rang out again, slicing to the fog of Amira's thoughts. I heard your grandfather was a talented pianist. Isn't that right? Amira stiffened. How did she know that? Tomorrow, Miss Carmichael continued, now facing class, you'll perform a piece for us. Should be interesting to hear the sound of a family with musical roots. A few chuckles bubbled up from the back of the room. Ryan Abbott muttered, Better not break a key. Amira sat silently, her expression unchanged, but inside, everything froze. She understood this was an invitation. It was a trap, and she'd just been pushed onto the stage without warning. When the final bell rang, Amira Bennett walked out of history class with feet that felt like they were made of stone. The Roosevelt High hallways bustled with the usual end-of-day chatter, but to her, every laugh and conversation only added weight to the pressure pressing down on her chest. She knew exactly what Miss Carmichael was doing. This wasn't about celebrating a family's artistic heritage. It was about putting Amira under the spotlight, not to be admired, but to be scrutinized. A performance everyone expected to collapse, so they have something to laugh at. And worse still, they thought she would break. Back at the second-floor apartment in the Green Hill housing complex, Amira dropped her bag and skipped dinner. Her mother, Shanice, was getting ready to leave for her night shift at the ER. You look nervous today, Ami, she said, tying her hair back and checking her wallet. Amira hesitated for a beat. I have to play piano tomorrow, in front of the whole class, she said quietly. Shanice paused, concern flashing in her eyes. Did Ms. Carmichael make you? Amira nodded, then added, She's not asking to listen. She wants to prove I can't. Shanice sighed, walked over, and placed a hand gently on her daughter's shoulder. They might not believe in you, but you have to believe in yourself first. After her mother left, Amira sat down at the old upright piano by the window. It had been her grandfather's, Elijah, a jazz musician who was never famous, but endlessly passionate. He had taught her to play at 6 years old, had told her that music wasn't for showing off, it was for storytelling. She lifted the lid, took a deep breath, and rested her fingers on the keys. At first, the notes came hesitantly, but as the minutes passed, the melody grew clearer, stronger. It wasn't a famous piece. It was her own, something she'd written after long days of being overlooked, after too many raised hands had gone unanswered. Every note was a piece of her, quiet, steady, not asking permission to exist. The music echoed through apartment 2B late into the night, blending with the sigh of the wind and the passing sounds of city buses below. Amira Bennett didn't play for entertainment. She played to keep from falling apart. She didn't know what she'd face tomorrow, but she knew one thing for certain. If they forced her to stand, she would stand tall. With memories of her grandfather flooding her senses, Amira played as if he were sitting beside her, nodding in time with every phrase. The piece she chose didn't have a name. She had written it on a rainy night when she was 12, after being unfairly blamed by a teacher for something she hadn't done. It began slowly with a slight ache in its rhythm, but gradually grew into a steady current, like a quiet wave spreading outward. The melody wasn't flashy. It didn't demand attention, but it was honest. It was her, subtle, patient, and needing no one's permission to be heard. Her fingers moved across the keys, sometimes soft as silk, sometimes crashing like a storm. Amira closed her eyes and imagined herself standing in front of her history class, facing curious glances, smirks, and the ones just waiting for her to stumble. But here, in the dim light of her small apartment, she didn't need to prove anything. She only needed to touch her truth. Outside, streetlights cast tree shadows across the window, flickering on the wall. Her younger brother, Malik, just 7, was still awake, sitting quietly by the doorway. "Are you sad?" he asked softly. Amira paused for a moment, then said, "No." I'm playing to remember Grandpa. Malik nodded. He didn't understand it all, but he knew this. When Amira played that song, the whole house seemed to breathe easier. She finished, took a deep breath, and closed the piano lid. Tomorrow would come, with all its doubt, challenge, and critical eyes. But tonight, it was just Amira, Grandpa Elijah, and the keys still warm from fingers bold enough to tell a story no one had wanted to hear. The next morning, the air in history class was thick. No one said out loud, but everyone knew. Today was a performance. Ms. Carmichael entered with her usual heavy perfume and indifferent expression, but her eyes flicked quickly toward the back of the room, where Amira sat with cloth folder clutched tightly in her hands, her fingers still faintly trembling. "Amira," the teacher said, flat, detached, "are you ready?" No one laughed, but few exchanged glances. Whispers curled through the air like wind through cracks. Some were clearly waiting for a misstep, hoping for a dramatic fall. Amira stood without a word. She walked toward the upright piano in the corner, a worn, amber-toned instrument, its keys yellowed and dull from age. No one ever touched it except during dull textbook sing-alongs. But today, it was about to tell a different story. She sat down, adjusted her posture, placed her fingers on the keys. The room fell completely still. Even Miss Carmichael stood frozen, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Then Amira began. The first note floated out, fragile, like she was whispering to herself. But the sound that followed grew fuller, deeper, like an underground spring bubbling through the cracks of dry earth. It wasn't a familiar piece. It was a blues composition, steeped in Southern soul, tinged with the breath of Grandpa Elijah, those late nights he played on creaky porches, surrounded by folks who had nothing left but a song. Amira didn't look at anyone. Her eyes remained closed, her fingers flowing like water over stone. She told her story, wordless, of forgotten lessons, of raised hands passed over like shadows, of what it felt like to never be truly seen. Each beat, each slide between notes was a letting go of what had weighed her down, a lifting of her truth into the air above them all. The final note rang out, thin and trembling like a silk thread, before dissolving quietly into the air. Amira remained seated, her hands resting gently on the keys, her heart pounding, but her face calm and unreadable. She didn't look up, didn't smile, didn't bow. She just sat there, as if she too was listening to the echo of her own voice. The classroom was completely silent, but it wasn't the usual silence of apathy. No one laughed. No one muttered a cruel remark under their breath. Only one thing was clear in that moment, uncertainty. And just beneath it, something else. Ms. Carmichael was still standing with her arms crossed, but her eyes had shifted. Gone was the smug composure, the air of command she usually carried. She blinked slowly, as if still processing what had just unfolded, something her mind hadn't fully grasped yet. No one moved. No one spoke. Only breath and eyes remained, dozens of them, all focused on Amira. But this time, they weren't waiting for her to fail. They were listening. From the back row, a voice spoke up. Malik Daniels, the quiet boy who, like Amira, had never drawn attention. "If Amira had played a wrong note today," he said, voice low but steady, "would you have still praised her for trying?" Every head turned toward Miss Carmichael. The question wasn't just for her. It was for everyone. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, and in that silence, there was no need for reply. Her quiet was an answer all its own. Amira finally looked up, meeting Malik's eyes. No words passed between them, but she gave a small nod, a thank you. Off to the left, a few students leaned forward, as if trying to get a clearer view of the Amira they had never truly seen. A girl from her literature group, who had never remembered her name before, whispered, "She's really good." No one had expected the soft-spoken black girl in the back row to shake the room without saying a word. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, followed by the usual shuffle of chairs and zipping backpacks. But today it was different. No one rushed. No one sprang up to chatter loudly. They stayed seated, still facing the piano, where Amira gently closed the lid. She stood, walked slowly back to her seat. No one spoke, but the silence was full of recognition. gone were the glances that passed through her like she was invisible. Now, they looked at her as if truly seeing her for the first time, a person who existed with power, depth, and a quiet defiance no one could ignore. Miss Carmichael stood silently at the front of the room, her arms wrapped around a stack of lesson plans she didn't bother flipping through. She looked like she wanted to say something, but instead, she just gave a small nod, a subtle gesture, one she probably couldn't explain herself. By the window, Tyrese Miller, the only person who had ever eaten lunch with Amira, tilted his head slightly toward her, a crooked smile forming on his face. "I guess you're not just a kid who turns in homework on time," he said as the dismissal bell echoed overhead. Amira smiled softly, saying nothing, but in his eyes there was something that looked very much like admiration. Down the second-floor hallway, where students bustled between periods, the whispers began. Some pointed in her direction, not mockingly, but with curiosity, surprise, and something else, caution. She was no longer quiet Amira in the back of the room. She was the girl who played the piano in silence class. At lunch in the cafeteria, a group from her language arts class invited her to sit with them. They didn't talk much, just asked a few casual questions, like they were trying to get to know her all over again. Amira didn't open up right away, but she didn't shrink back either. She understood now. Change doesn't come from one performance. It comes from how you choose to show up. That afternoon, as she walked out the school gates, she overheard a group of students whispering behind her. I've never seen Miss Carmichael just stand there like that. She really made them listen. Amira kept walking. Her backpack felt heavier than usual, not because of textbooks, but because of the attention, the glances, the expectations. But she wasn't afraid, because for the first time, she didn't need to shout to be seen. She just needed to be heard. That evening, Amira sat by her bedroom window, the old upright piano in the living room resting silently in its corner, like a trusted friend dozing after a long journey. In her lap was a worn music notebook, its pages curled at the edges, filled with scattered notes and smudged pencil markings. She didn't write any music that night. Instead, Amira wrote a letter, not to anyone, not to explain, not to apologize, just to herself, a quiet reminder. I don't need to become someone else to be seen. I just need the courage to stop hiding who I am. The next morning, during homeroom, something unexpected happened. Ms. Carmichael walked in looking more subdued than usual, a single sheet of paper in her hand. "We'll have 10 minutes of open sharing time at the end of class," she announced, her voice not as sharp as it used to be. "If anyone wants to speak about something they've been holding inside, this is your chance." The room went silent. No one moved, until Sophia Tran, the quiet Vietnamese-American girl who sat near the window and almost never spoke, rose from her seat. Her hands trembled slightly as she said, "I used to think I didn't have a voice here, but yesterday, because of Amira, I realized silence has its own kind of strength. And sometimes standing up isn't about being seen, it's about not disappearing." The classroom fell still. Amira looked up at Sophia and met that shimmering gaze, a look that saw right through the thick glass of assumptions and silence. And in that moment, she finally understood. Her music hadn't just spoken for herself. It had unlocked a door for others, those who had once believed their voices didn't belong in a room like this. When the bell rang, Amira didn't rush out as usual. She lingered, eyes fixed on the whiteboard where someone had scribbled in uneven handwriting, "Sharing is strength." Right then, she no longer felt the need to prove anything. She had redefined herself, not through arguments, not through speeches, but through music, something that didn't need permission to exist, only honesty to be heard. That day, Amira wasn't just seen. She became a voice for the unheard. That afternoon, the school courtyard was quieter than usual. The sky was overcast, and the last rays of sun faded behind the overhang of Building A. Amira sat alone on an old wooden bench. The piano in the auditorium had been locked away, but the echo of it still pulsed inside her, like a second heartbeat in her chest. She didn't need anyone to say, "You played beautifully," or "You're so talented." If those words ever came, they wouldn't matter as much, because what she had received wasn't applause, It was silence. A silence that didn't avoid, didn't dismiss. A silence that listened. And in that moment, all the noise of past dismissals, of quiet prejudice and invisible boundaries, finally stopped. Since the performance, Amira had become famous. She wasn't invited on stage at a school assembly. No features ran in the student newsletter. But something had shifted. The glances that once passed right over her in the hallways now carried a pause, a hesitation, not of fear, but of reconsideration. No longer cold indifference. No longer invisibility. Back at the small second-floor apartment where she lived with her mother and grandmother, Amira placed her music notebook back on the shelf, right next to the framed photo of her grandfather, the man who had handed her belief one worn piano key at a time. Her grandmother rested a hand on her shoulder, her gaze warm and steady. "Your music didn't change the world in one afternoon," she said softly, "but you made them hear you in a way they can't ignore." That night, Amira didn't practice. Instead, she sat in the cramped kitchen with her mom and grandma, passing around slices of toast spread with peanut butter. No one brought up what happened the day before. They didn't have to, because the most important thing had already happened. Amira had stood up for herself. She'd chosen not to let anyone else write her story. On the cover of her music notebook, she added one more line in bold black ink. "I am the only one who gets to define me." She didn't need applause. She didn't need praise. All she needed was a piano, a moment, and a heart no longer afraid. And just like that, Amira Bennett, the quiet girl in the corner, the one so often overlooked, became the strongest voice in a room that once refused to hear her.